5 years ago, the world changed forever, and a pandemic called COVID-19 made people all around the world realize just how heavy-handed their government could be. Now, Bill Gates, who was a prominent figure during COVID, says there's a 10 to 15% chance of another pandemic. And yet I would ask, how many people who protested the lack of freedoms during COVID have gone back to life as usual, maybe angrier, but their normal life in their own country, never having made any changes? Today, I'm going to tell you what you should do to be prepared for the next time this happens. And I want to be clear. I think anytime there's an issue, there's probably some common sense things the government could do. But we all saw how particularly Western governments, as well as some non-Western governments, were totally out of control. They stopped their citizens from leaving the country. They stopped their own citizens from returning to the country, in the case of Australia, which is totally against all the international law. They literally did whatever they wanted. And so for me, we may have reasonable differences on how people should respond to a pandemic, but not letting your own citizens in, totally suppressing freedom of speech while claiming that you are very much for freedom of speech, it really showed me, and it showed a lot of our clients, just how heavy-handed, particularly legacy brand countries who aren't used to competition, became. My question is, are you prepared for the next time this happens? It may not be a pandemic. For me, you look at 9/11, for example. That's a time when I think a lot of us believe after 9/11, the world just got so much darker. And what happened after 9/11 in the United States? I was there. Conservatives in the Bush administration suddenly became like left-wing Democrats. Let's have the government take over everything. Let's get rid of private enterprise. Let's not have, businesses doing security. Let's put the government in charge of it. And what's happened? It's become heavier-handed and heavier-handed. And that's one of the reasons why I ultimately left the United States. I do not physically feel comfortable living in the United States. And as someone who travels, I certainly never felt comfortable traveling to and from and through the United States. Why? Because something terrible happened. They took advantage of the public, letting them do whatever they want. And no matter which political party would have been in charge, they would have done the same thing. Biden was in charge during much of COVID in the United States, but now Trump's doing some of the same stuff that I've complained about. Not about COVID, but the point is, no politician's your friend. If your country's culture is to be heavy-handed, all they're going to do is wait for a moment for that to happen. And so are you prepared for whatever it is that's going to come next? Are you prepared for that? Most people have moved on figuring, hey, that's not going to happen again. In the same way, no one's going to fly a plane into a building again. Sure. Other stuff was tried. The guy tried to light his underwear on fire. What will the next pandemic be? Nobody knows. That's why it's called a Black Swan event. Nobody can really predict what's going to happen. But tyrants are going to be tyrants, and they're going to look for chances to be tyrants. And I want to highlight, I think, the differences in the way that I live and what we talk about here versus what some people living in the West are experiencing. Because no doubt you have fewer liberties. I've paid attention to politics since I was a preteen. I can tell you, just feeling it and looking at the evidence, every decade that's gone by, you have fewer liberties in the U.S. and other Western countries. My solution for this has always been geographical diversification. Now, people will say, once they started closing the borders during COVID, what are you supposed to do? Well, if you had a citizenship or a permanent residence, in many cases, you could have gone back to that country. I mean, there were flights. It was harder, but you could have moved around during COVID. I'm going to talk about my experiences moving around. But the point is, if you live in a country with a heavy-handed government, you probably want to get out before the next heavy-handed Black Swan event. As I always say, better years too early than a day too late. And so I was relatively flexible during COVID. Obviously, when you flew in a plane, there was a time when, business class, they wouldn't even give you a meal, and you had to wear a mask, and there were some things that were done. But I didn't stop traveling. I chose. I came back. I was in Myanmar just as the pandemic broke out. I got a call. Yeah, I'm not coming to Myanmar to meet you for our trip. You gotta come back because they're gonna close the border. And I did, and I made it just in time. And we spent about 6 weeks in Malaysia. I'd go to the grocery store pretty much every day. I would, buy wine and buy, we'd have great wine every night, and we'd be making cheese platters with great French cheeses, and we had a time kind of stuck inside. the way a lot of people were, where, I felt it was relatively open, and I felt in a culture where, I think a lot of places in the world cracked down. I felt a little bit distanced from that, quite frankly. And Malaysia, by some metrics, reopened before Florida, the place that Americans say, oh, thank goodness we were here in the U.S. You should have been here in Florida. Malaysia actually reopened before Florida. And I think that when they were both closed, Malaysia was probably, at least for me and where I live, a little bit more flexible. One of the issues why people couldn't travel during COVID was they couldn't get their passports issued. I remember selling a property during COVID times. The guy couldn't buy the property. He sent the money, and we waited for close to a year, if I remember correctly, because he couldn't get his U.S. passport issued to put on the contract. He certainly couldn't travel. He certainly couldn't open a foreign bank account to protect his assets if he saw some kind of threat. Couldn't buy property. Couldn't do much of anything. Basically, was at the mercy of the U.S. government. A lot of people were at the mercy of their governments where they couldn't even get a passport. So my point here is you want to have a passport from the country that you're a citizen of now. You want to get an extra passport, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But you want to be looking at what's the zeitgeist in the country that you live in and focus on the facts, not your feelings. The moving average of freedom in the United States has been moving in the wrong direction for as long as I've been alive. And there's more competition now than ever. You don't have to be Jordan Peterson and move to the U.S. just because it's 1 point better than Canada. There's a heck of a lot more free, better places, in my opinion, to live than any Western country. And I think people look at their feelings of, oh, but now Trump's in charge, or, oh, we're electing some right-wing party in whatever country. And that's going to solve what I believe are systemic issues of heavy-handed politicians who want to control your life. I don't trust politicians, particularly those in big legacy brain countries. I don't believe that net Trump would do more for me than Biden would. Yes, there's some things that irritate me about Biden that don't irritate me about Trump. If you value personal freedom, no politician in the U.S. or Canada or Australia or the U.K. is ultimately going to protect you from this. You need to be in a place where the culture is we leave people alone and let them do what they want. Doug Casey wrote the book The International Man many, many years ago. He speaks at Nomad Capitalist Live many years. And what he told me was the government always protects the capital. They take care of themselves first. And that's what they did. During COVID, the government took advantage of martial law to freeze assets in some countries. Politicians became gods. They relished newfound fame. And it became sort of a cult of personality. And again, listen, I think there was extremes on both sides. But at the end of the day, I value personal freedom. And if you want personal freedom, there's a cultural difference where my belief is you need residence permits and citizenships in places where there are differences. This is a message I cannot get across strongly enough. Let's take the United States where I'm from. People say, oh yeah, we're going to go. The UK, you think that's any better? No. Let me tell you one place I've been talking about as an extreme. I've been telling people, get residence permits and or citizenship in an African country. Well, that's crazy. You ought to live there. I didn't say you should move to Africa. I said if you had access to live in Africa, and one thing I'm watching is the African Union, which comprises pretty much all the countries on the continent, is looking to harmonize, and it's not going to be as pro-Western. They're going to have a distinctly African agenda. They want to have more, unity throughout the continent. If you were to get one African passport, for example, Egypt has a citizenship by investment program. You buy an apartment, you get a passport. You put money in the bank, you get a passport. Take your pick, hold that investment for 3 to 5 years, sell it. Potentially, the passport could be free by the time you recoup your investment. The fees you paid for the passport could possibly be refunded by a decent investment. And let's say the African Union, does more, liberalization of migration, for example, where if you're Egyptian, you'd have the ability to live in other countries. I do think that's coming. But what's interesting about Africa is they're pushing back on a lot of this stuff that the Western world is involved in. I mean, when you look at some of the coups in Western Africa, those countries perhaps are of greater concern. But look at what's happened there in the last 3-4 years. It's we don't want France. It's we don't want the West. It's we're doing something different. Now, no doubt, I've been to a number of countries in Africa. Not all of them are that livable. But, even in Cairo, there's some nice places to live in Egypt if you became an Egyptian citizen. Certainly in South Africa, it's not a very tax-friendly place. You could very easily live in Cape Town. It's very nice. It certainly is statistically less safe than a number of other countries. But we're talking about your personal freedom. There's places, I mean, we had a guy talk to us about countries in East Africa where they've got, beautiful islands that you can live on. And it's not, maybe it's not the most ostentatious life, but he's like, nobody's bothering you here. Absolutely nobody. And so that's the reality. And I almost think there's a form of Stockholm syndrome from people who are from Western countries where they're like, well, our government is always looming large. So like, if the government isn't looming large somewhere, that must mean there's something wrong with the place. Yeah, listen, no doubt. I mean, living on an island off the coast of Mozambique is not going to be as nice as living in Midtown Manhattan. I don't think you have to do that. I think that there are places almost anywhere in the world where if you have some money, you can go and you can live in comfort and you can be safe. I've proven that. I live in places that the average person where I'm from wouldn't want to live. If I went back to Avon Lake High School in Cleveland, Ohio, and said, "Hey, I live part of the year in Tbilisi, Georgia," and remember that place I always talked about in my speeches with the Petronas Towers, Kuala Lumpur, that you all kind of laughed at me? I live there, in Bogota, Colombia, and I go to African. I'm going to Cambodia this year. That kind of interests me. They'd be like, "What the hell?" I live a great life in these places, and so I think that Africa is one place. As a plan, C, D, E, F, somewhere in there, have a residence permit or a citizenship in a place where go and check it out. Yeah, there are some countries in Africa that I would say are a total no-go, but I think that the continent is going to open up over time, and there could be opportunities there. There's places you could live in Egypt that are a delight. Go and live on the coast west of Alexandria. There's some beautiful places. I mean, the UAE is doing a whole job on the Mediterranean coast. I mean, there's some nice areas on the Red Sea that are very well managed. I mean, you don't have to live in Cairo. You could live in some beautiful villas, and you can get a citizenship by buying into those programs. And I mean, I think Egypt is a place that probably takes a little bit different response, partially because they have to, partially because they know people won't put up with it. One of the things that we see in the West is, yeah, people did come out and protest, not to the extent they did somewhere else. Here's another citizenship program you can get, is Turkey. I was in Turkey on the weekend of the alleged lockdown. Nobody can leave the house. It was December of 2020. And I was there because I bought a property. And the guy's like, yeah, I think you can probably go out. We were walking around Taksim Square. There were kids playing football. There were people selling kebabs. I mean, people, and the police were just standing there watching it. And every once in a while, I think we went for like a 4 or 5 hour walk. And one time it's like, hey, like, show me your passport. Is that ideal? Yeah. Well, I mean, there were people in, Western countries that were literally locked inside. What I've been telling you for years is lockdowns in one were not lockdowns in the other. There's a culture in a place like Turkey. And in a lot of these places, the global south, as they call it, the places where I live, where it's like, fine. And I'm not saying to do anything unethical. I'm not saying to do anything untoward. I am the goody two-shoes of the offshore world. I like to play by the rules. But I like to go where the rules are reasonable. And again, let's not have Stockholm syndrome that because your government dictates your every move, somehow you can't go somewhere else. And they're like, listen, the spirit of this is like, let's be careful. But like, if you want to go out and get a kebab, be our guest. And so I think you want places like that. This is one reason I have Cyrus Jansen speak at Nomad Capitalist Live. He's coming for the second year in Kuala Lumpur this year because he talks about places that aren't on most people's radar and that most Westerners, like them, I'm sure if I went back to my high school, they'd say this. What? You went where? Well, just because it's not on your radar doesn't mean it's terrible and doesn't mean it's not doing well. And I think Asia perhaps is somewhere that would be not heavy-handed from a cultural perspective, but it's very much we have to follow health. If it's a pandemic, I've traveled to Asia for close to 2 decades now. For years I've been going through, we've got a bird flu, go through this machine, make sure you don't have a fever. I mean, they're focused on health. That's their thing. And they will be more focused on that. I don't know that if it's some other kind of Black Swan event, Asia is going to be as heavy-handed. But the bottom line is, it is the global South. There were some outliers. I remember in Panama, they weren't as good. I would say that's more Western influenced, perhaps. But I was able to travel around, and I went from Malaysia After it reopened, we traveled all over Malaysia. Then it's okay. We're going to go to Serbia and spend a few months. And Serbia was pretty open. There were some curfews for maybe a month or so, but it was relatively open compared to what most people I was talking about. I remember talking to a guy who was in St. Bart's having the time of his life around that same time. Then I went to Colombia, and that was pretty open. And yeah, there was a time when they had like, oh, show your ID, even numbers today, odd numbers tomorrow. But one of the things is when you're a foreigner, you might not have the same kind of ID to where it's just like, okay, you're a foreigner, go on in. So my pitch to you is, I think you ought to have different residence permits and citizenships to where whatever happens, could be the next pandemic, could be a war, could be a trade war, could be a geopolitical event, could be who knows what. That's why it's called a Black Swan event. It's not predictable. If you have different residence permits and citizenships, you can be moving around. Now, is that 100% perfect? No. There were some places, I mean, Australia being, I think, the biggest culprit, their own citizens couldn't get in. You paid half your money in taxes for your entire life. You went on a holiday somewhere, and they literally stranded you and left you to rot. Why would you go back to that country and keep paying them and keep putting, oh, we elected a new guy, Tony Albania now. He's going to solve it all. No, it's going to be the same thing next time. It's in the DNA. I just don't think most countries have ever had the opportunity to go and screw with everybody the way that the U.S. or Canada has. That's just not possible. It's just never been how it exists. The governments are not as well funded. They don't want to be, do what you want. And so you want a portfolio of residence permits and citizenships around the world. This is why I keep accumulating them. At this point, I think I'm pretty well diversified. I think with, what do I have? Something like 11 residence permits and passports, and I'm working on more. I mean, at this point, it's a hobby for me. But if you can get up to some fraction of where I'm at, you will have the freedom, the same as I did, to where you will be welcome. I went to Colombia as a permanent resident. There was a time when tourists were not allowed in. I was allowed in, and there were really no conditions to that. You're a permanent resident? Please come right in. How did I get that? I bought a property there. So I think that, my philosophy for many years has been buy properties and open bank accounts, and in some cases just show you have income as a condition to get these various residence permits and passports. So you're moving some assets around. In my case, in Colombia, you have a home. Okay, that's where you go when you want to go to Colombia because that's better than somewhere else. In other cases, you don't have a home, but you could always rent or stay in a hotel or figure something out. But my idea is, how do I contribute some money to get these residence permits and citizenships to where I've got places to go? And that's exactly what I did. I have a home in Belgrade, but it was being renovated back when I was there in 2020. So I spent 3 months in a hotel. They put me in a beautiful suite for, I don't know, it was $125 a night. They just upgraded me from the regular room to the best suite because I was staying there for 3 months. And it was a great time. It was a nice time to be there. And I think if you put that together, then you will be able to go different places. It's not going to be totally foolproof. Robert Kiyosaki said at our first Nomad Capitalist Live in 2021, he said, where can you get in 3 days? He said, 3 days. That's how long you have. I would argue you want to be there ideally before something happens. But you want to read the tea leaves. Where's my country going? What's the next event? What's going to happen? And I had hoped the next time something like COVID happens, people aren't going to sit around and think, oh, it's this time probably won't be that bad. Heavy-handed countries are going to be heavy-handed. So I have a collection of neutral and distinctly different countries in your portfolio that's not like where you live, right? If, something different's going to happen, but it'll be the same result. Have a place where you're different. Oh, I don't want to be the white guy in Asia. I think being the white guy might be better in some places. And let's get out of this sphere of, oh, the U.S. is the problem. Let's go to the U.K. No. Neutral and different places. Again, if you're in the West, it's the global South. Get your residence permits, get your citizenships. We've got almost 3,000 videos talking about some of those various places that you can go. Or you can go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. We work with clients to put together their portfolio. What I've done isn't necessarily what you should do. You need your own portfolio of residences and citizenships. And by the way, once you have them, maybe you decide you want to move to one of those countries part or full time, and you can dramatically reduce your taxes. There's a whole ecosystem here. We can support you with all of it. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. If you don't have $1 million, or if you're just starting out and you want to dip your toe in, come to our live event, Nomad Capitalist Live. See what Kuala Lumpur is like. I have not brought a single person here personally that hasn't been blown away at how it exceeded their expectations and how they're like, you know what? I could pretty easily live here. This is much better than what I expected. That's why we have our event, not in Austin. Learn how to escape the U.S. in Austin, Texas. That's why the event is in Kuala Lumpur, because you're going to come and see just how good life can be in these places. Be our client at nomadcapitalist.com. Come to our event. We'd love to have you.
This is Bali. This is how to live like a king.